The first time someone told me to get off my own dock, I honestly thought he was joking. I was sitting there early on a Saturday morning with a fishing rod in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other, watching the sunrise spread across Blackwater Lake, when a pontoon boat came gliding straight toward my family's dock. A man in mirrored sunglasses stepped off the boat like he owned the place, pointed at my folding chair, and said, "You mind moving that? My kids need room to get off." For a second, I just stared at him. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because my brain couldn't process what I just heard. The guy didn't laugh back. His wife crossed her arms and looked annoyed. One of the kids was already stepping onto the dock. "We have lake access rights," the man said. "It's part of our property package." I remember blinking twice, waiting for somebody to explain the joke. Nobody did. That was the exact moment a normal Saturday morning turned into the beginning of the biggest legal fight of my life. My name is Ryan Cooper, and my family has owned the southern shore of Blackwater Lake for generations. My great-grandfather bought the land back in 1935 when hardly anybody wanted it. Back then it was mostly timber, brush, and a narrow creek running through a valley. He built a small dam with a crew of local workers, flooded part of the basin, and created the lake that still exists today. The water became the center of our family's life. Every major memory seemed connected to it somehow. Fishing trips with my father, summer cookouts, my wedding photos, my daughter's first canoe ride. Even after all these years, whenever I looked across that water, I didn't just see a lake. I saw family history. That's why I never paid much attention when a luxury development started going up on the ridge across from us. The project was called Silver Ridge Estates. Expensive homes, big views, private roads, all the usual things developers love to advertise. At first, I figured it would be good for the area. More investment, better roads, higher property values. I certainly never imagined it would become my problem. Construction lasted nearly 3 years. Trees disappeared. Bulldozers arrived. Utility lines went in. Then the houses started appearing one by one. Huge homes with oversized windows, all facing the lake. Looking back now, that should have been my first clue. The lake wasn't just part of the scenery. It was the main product being sold. I just didn't realize it at the time. Over the next year, I started noticing more people near the shoreline. Families walking around. Kayaks appearing on weekends. Boats on the water that I didn't recognize. At first it seemed harmless. Then things got stranger. One afternoon, I found a couple having a picnic on my shoreline. Another weekend, someone tied a jet ski directly to my dock. Every time I confronted somebody, I got the same response. "The community has lake access. The sales office told us we could use it. It's included with ownership." The confidence in their voices bothered me more than the trespassing itself. These people weren't sneaking around. They genuinely believed they had every right to be there. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with my wife, Emily. She listened while I vented about the latest incident. When I finished, she asked a simple question that changed everything. What exactly are these people being told? I didn't have an answer. The truth was, I had never looked at a single brochure from Silver Ridge Estates. I had never attended an HOA meeting. I had never spoken to the developer. I'd spent years assuming everybody understood the lake belonged to our family because it always had. That assumption suddenly felt dangerous. Around midnight, I walked into the storage room behind our garage where decades of family records were stacked in old filing cabinets and cardboard boxes. My grandfather never threw anything away. Property maps, surveys, permits, tax records, handwritten notes, yellowed photographs, everything was still there. I spent hours digging through paperwork. Dust covered my hands. My knees hurt from kneeling on concrete. Around 2 in the morning, I found something that made my stomach sink. It was a glossy Silver Ridge Estates marketing brochure. I have no idea how it ended up in our storage room. Maybe someone left it in our mailbox months earlier. Maybe I tossed it aside without reading it. But there it was. I opened the cover and immediately felt my pulse jump. The front page featured a massive drone photograph of Blackwater Lake. My family's dock sat right in the center of the image. Not a similar dock. Not a stock photo. My actual dock. The same cedar posts. The same boat ramp. The same shoreline. Across the top were 6 words printed in giant bold letters. Private lake access for every resident. I remember reading that sentence 3 times because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Then I kept turning pages. Every page made things worse. Families fishing, families boating, families swimming. Every image centered around the lake. Every caption implied homeowners would enjoy full access to the water. The entire development had been marketed around a lifestyle that depended on a lake the developer didn't appear to own. I felt cold sitting there on the garage floor. Not angry. Not yet. Just uneasy. Because if what I was seeing was true, dozens of families may have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars believing they were buying rights that never existed. The next morning, I drove through Silver Ridge Estates for the first time in months. Everywhere I looked, I saw references to the lake. Sales banners, welcome signs, community maps. The water wasn't simply part of the neighborhood. It was the neighborhood. Without the lake, half the marketing campaign would collapse overnight. I parked near an overlook and sat there staring across the water toward my property. That's when the full weight of the situation finally landed on my shoulders. If I was wrong, I'd be picking a fight with a developer backed by millions of dollars and an army of attorneys. If I was right, an entire community had been sold a promise built on land that didn't belong to the people making the promise. Neither possibility felt good. When I got home, Emily met me on the porch and asked what I planned to do next. I looked across the lake toward the expensive houses sitting on the ridge, toward the families enjoying a view they believe came with ownership rights. And I quietly said, I'm going to find out exactly who owns that water. What I didn't know then was that the answer would ignite a war involving dozens of homeowners, a furious HOA, anonymous threats, and a courtroom battle that would eventually leave an entire luxury community stunned. The following Monday, I called a water rights attorney named Daniel Harper out of Jefferson City. He wasn't cheap, which usually means one of two things in the legal world. Either they're really good or they're really good at sending invoices. I was hoping for the first option. When I explained the situation over the phone, there was a long pause. Then he asked one question. Do you have the original property records? I told him I had records going back almost 90 years. He said, don't touch anything. I'm coming down. 2 days later, Daniel was sitting in my dining room table surrounded by enough paperwork to make an accountant cry. Survey maps covered every available surface. Old permits were spread across the floor. Historical deeds sat in organized stacks. He spent hours reading without saying much. Every now and then he'd circle something with a pen or make a note. I watched his face more than the documents. Lawyers are trained to hide emotions, but every once in a while I'd catch a slight raise of an eyebrow or a small shake of the head. Those little reactions made me nervous. By late afternoon, he leaned back in his chair, removed his glasses, and let out a slow breath. Well, he said, this is about as clear as ownership gets. I felt my stomach tighten. Meaning, he tapped one of the documents. Your family owns the dam. Then another. Your family owns the lake bed. Another. Your family owns the spillway. Another. The water rights were never transferred. Then he looked directly at me. Ryan, they sold views of the lake. They never bought the lake itself. For a second, the room went completely silent. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt sick, because now I knew exactly how big the problem really was. If Daniel was right, dozens of families had purchased homes under assumptions that were legally worthless. Not because they had done anything wrong, but because somebody else had made promises they couldn't legally make. Daniel must have noticed the look on my face. You aren't responsible for what the developer told them. Maybe not, I said, but I'm the one who's going to have to tell them. He nodded slowly. And they're not going to like it. Over the next week, we assembled everything into a formal legal package. Copies of deeds, survey maps, historical permits, ownership records, water rights documentation. By the time we were finished, the evidence looked overwhelming. Daniel drafted a certified letter addressed to the Silver Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. The letter was professional, polite, and devastating. It informed them that Blackwater Lake, the primary dock, the boat ramp, the dam, and all related access points remained private property belonging to my family. Any unauthorized use constituted trespassing. Future access would require written permission. I signed the documents and mailed them. Then I waited. For days later, the phone started ringing. The first call came from a homeowner named Susan. She sounded confused more than angry. "There must be some mistake," she said. "The sales office told us lake access was guaranteed." I explained the situation as gently as possible. She thanked me and hung up. The second call was less pleasant. The third was worse. By the end of the week, my voicemail sounded like a collection of people discovering they had bought tickets to a concert that didn't exist. Some were angry at the developer. Some were angry at me. A few seemed angry at reality itself. Then the HOA board requested a meeting. Daniel strongly advised me not to go alone, so we attended together. The clubhouse was packed. Homeowners filled every chair. Others stood along the walls. The atmosphere felt less like a community meeting and more like a courtroom waiting for a verdict. HOA President Mark Ellison sat at the front with several board members. He looked like the kind of man who had never accepted being wrong about anything in his life. As soon as the meeting started, he held up our legal letter. "Are you seriously claiming ownership of the entire lake?" he asked. Daniel answered before I could. "We're not claiming ownership. We're documenting ownership." That didn't go over well. Murmurs spread across the room. Mark frowned. Residents purchased homes based on lake access. Daniel remained calm. "Then your issue may be with the developer." A woman near the back stood up. "We paid extra for lakefront property." Another homeowner shouted, "This affects property values." Someone else yelled, "You can't just take away access." That's when I finally stood up. "I'm not taking anything away. I never gave away in the first place." The room went quiet. Not because people agreed with me, because they didn't want to hear it. I understood why. Nobody likes finding out they spent hundreds of thousands of dollars based on a misunderstanding, especially not one this expensive. The meeting ended without a resolution. 3 days later, I made a decision that turned frustration into open warfare. I locked the boat ramp. The ramp sat on my family's property and represented the easiest way to launch boats into the lake. I installed a heavy chain across the entrance and posted large signs clearly identifying the area as private property. Then I closed the dock as well. Legally, it was the safest move. Emotionally, it felt like throwing a lit match into a fireworks factory. The reaction was immediate. Social media exploded. Community message boards filled with complaints. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some residents claimed I was trying to extort the neighborhood. Others insisted I was secretly planning to sell access rights. A few even suggested I didn't really own the lake despite every document saying otherwise. Then things got personal. One evening I walked out of a grocery store and found a note tucked under my windshield wiper. It read, "Hope the lake is worth it. No signature." Just that. A week later, somebody dumped trash near our property gate. Then my truck tires were slashed while parked outside a restaurant 30 miles away. Maybe it was connected. Maybe it wasn't. But the timing felt suspicious. Emily tried to stay positive, but I could see the stress wearing on her. One night, she sat across from me at the kitchen table and asked the question neither of us wanted to discuss. "Do you think we should back down?" I stared at my coffee for several seconds before answering. Back down from what? From fighting everyone. I understood what she meant. We weren't just dealing with a developer anymore. We were dealing with an entire community. Families, parents, kids, people who genuinely believed they had been promised something. The hardest part was knowing many of them weren't villains. Most were victims just like us. They had simply arrived later in the story. But every time I considered compromising, I remembered that brochure. The photographs. The promises. The assumption that somebody else's property could be packaged and sold without permission. That thought always brought me back to the same conclusion. If I surrendered now, I would be rewarding the lie that created the problem in the first place. A month after the boat ramp was closed, attendance at HOA meetings reached record levels. Tension spread through the entire neighborhood. Some residents wanted to sue the developer. Others wanted to sue me. Guess which group won the vote? 2 weeks later, a thick envelope arrived at my house. I already knew what it was before opening it. The HOA had officially filed a lawsuit. Their attorneys argued that homeowners possessed implied access rights based on marketing materials, purchase expectations, and community representations made during the sales process. I handed the paperwork to Daniel. He skimmed the first few pages and laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not a surprised laugh. The kind of laugh a mechanic makes when someone tells him their engine failed because the tires were low. What? I asked. He dropped the documents onto the table. Ryan, this case is going to answer one very expensive question. What's that? Daniel smiled. Whether a brochure can magically become a property deed. And for the first time since this whole nightmare started, I had a feeling the people who created the problem were finally about to face consequences of their own. The court hearing took place 3 months later, and by that point the entire situation had become local gossip across half the county. People showed up just to watch. Homeowners filled the gallery. Reporters sat along the back wall. Even a few real estate agents appeared, probably hoping to learn how not to market a development. I remember sitting beside Daniel while the HOA's attorneys laid out their argument. To be fair, they weren't completely unreasonable. Their clients had purchased homes believing lake access came with ownership. They had brochures, advertisements, sales presentations, and years of verbal assurances. The problem was that none of those things were deeds. None of them transferred property rights. None of them created legal ownership. When our turn came, Daniel didn't need dramatic speeches. He simply presented the documents. Original surveys, recorded deeds, water rights records, historical permits, chain of ownership stretching back nearly a century. The evidence wasn't complicated. It was just undeniable. The judge spent a long time reviewing everything. The room stayed quiet enough to hear papers turning. Finally, he looked up and asked the HOA attorney a question that seemed simple at first. Can you show me any recorded easement granting your clients access to this lake? The attorney hesitated, then admitted he could not. The judge nodded. Any deed? No. Any legal transfer of rights? No. Another pause followed. Then came the sentence people still quote whenever this story comes up. The judge leaned back in his chair and said, "A brochure is not a deed. A photograph is not an easement. Marketing language does not create ownership." Just like that, the entire argument collapsed. The case was dismissed. I didn't celebrate. I didn't cheer. Honestly, I mostly felt tired. Months of stress had drained the excitement out of victory. But the reaction from the homeowners was impossible to ignore. You could almost feel the room shift. For the first time, many of them stopped looking at me as the enemy. Their attention turned toward the people who had sold them the promise in the first place. Before ending the hearing, the judge made one final comment. He said that if homeowners believed they had been misled during the purchase process, they should carefully consider who actually made those representations. He never directly told them to sue the developer. He didn't have to. Everyone understood exactly what he meant. 6 months later, Silver Ridge Development found itself facing multiple lawsuits from homeowners. Discovery records started surfacing. Internal emails appeared. Meeting notes appeared. Conversations that were never supposed to become public suddenly became very public. I learned later that several executives had known ownership of the lake remained unresolved long before construction finished. Whether they believed it would never become a problem or simply assumed nobody would challenge them, I still don't know. What I do know is that the confidence they sold to buyers eventually became evidence against them. While all of that unfolded, something unexpected happened. One afternoon, I received a call from HOA President Mark Ellison, the same man who had spent months fighting me. "Can we meet?" he asked. His tone sounded completely different. Gone was the arrogance. Gone was the anger. What remained was exhaustion. We met at a small diner overlooking the highway. For a few minutes, neither of us talked about the lake. Then Mark finally sighed and got to the point. "The neighborhood still wants access." I nodded. "I figured. And you still own it. According to several thousand pages of paperwork, yes." He laughed despite himself. Then he slid a folder across the table. Inside was a proposal. Not a demand, not a threat, a proposal. The HOA wanted to lease access to the dock and boat ramp. For the first time since this began, we weren't arguing about fantasy ownership rights. We were discussing reality. Negotiations lasted weeks, maybe months if you count all the attorney calls. Eventually, we reached an agreement. The HOA would receive limited access through a long-term lease. Every household would contribute annual fees. The amount would adjust with inflation over time. My family would maintain control of the dam, the spillway, and all major infrastructure. We retained the authority to temporarily close access during drought conditions, repairs, safety concerns, or environmental issues. Most importantly, ownership never changed. The lake remained exactly what it had always been, ours. The day the agreement was finalized, I walked down to the dock alone. The water was calm. A light breeze moved through the trees. For the first time in over a year, nobody was threatening lawsuits. Nobody was accusing anybody of stealing anything. The fight was finally over. Sometimes people ask whether I regret standing my ground. The answer depends on the day you ask. The stress was enormous. The threats were real. My family paid a price. But every July when I see kids swimming in the lake under rules everyone understands, I think about my great-grandfather building that dam all those decades ago. He believed ownership mattered, responsibility mattered, truth mattered. And every January when a check arrives from the HOA for access rights they once claimed were free, I can't help smiling a little. Not because anyone lost, but because reality eventually won. The developers sold a dream. They sold views, sunsets, and promises. My family kept the water underneath all of it. And here's the question I want to leave with you. If you have been one of those homeowners, who would you blame? The family protecting property they legally owned, or the developer who built an entire sales pitch around something that was never theirs to give away? Let me know in the comments, because even now, years later, people still argue about who was right, who was wrong, and whether I should have simply opened the gate and avoided the fight altogether. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your own HOA nightmare stories below. Trust me, after everything I've seen, nothing surprises me anymore.